Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be diving back in to the Druhkari, and we're going to be talking about the index versus the codex. Now, recently, I've made a couple of videos about the Druhkari Codex, and honestly, for the most part, I've sung its praises. There are a few things that I think kind of suck about the Druhkari Codex, and I've not been really that hesitant to mention what that is, but for the most part, both gameplay-wise and flavor-wise, I find the Codex very cool. And what I mean by flavor, I'm just going to define it right now for you guys right off the bat. I am not talking about fluff. I am not talking about, different types of units, stuff like that. What I'm really talking about is the gameplay. The flavor of the detachments, the flavor of the army as a whole is much better in the Codex. Having said that, there is a bit of a myth circulating around the Codex, that the Codex is essentially a much weaker version, competitively and narratively, than the Index. And I would just like to kind of get this video out there to dispel the myths surrounding this, kind of controversial Codex, because it has been a little bit controversial. A lot of people don't like it in the community. I know for a fact that people who were proud owners of beast packs, grotesques, all the units that were lost and have gone to Legends, are not happy with the Codex as a whole. They're not happy with GW. And I have to say, personally, I'm not happy with GW about that either, and I'll go into why later in the video. But I don't entirely think everything people are saying about the Codex is true. And I'm talking about from a factual, mathematical standpoint. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and dive right in, and we are going to see whether the naysayers are correct about the index being better than the codex in the game. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to dive into the index and codex controversy. We're going to be looking at the numbers, the data and statistics, and we're going to be talking about the bottom line. What's better, the index or the codex? Okay, so let's talk about the controversy. Now, there's three main parts to this controversy, which I will explain in a little bit. The first point is that pain tokens have been nerfed severely, and the Codex pain tokens only give units abilities that they already had in the index. So essentially, recycling the same abilities, again, just in a different way and making Dark Eldar units pay resources for things that they already had base in the index. 2, losing rerolls with pain tokens, and that's going to reduce the damage, advance, and charge reliability of your units. So that's the other one. And the last one is losing 4 datasheets, basically killed the variability of the codex, and destroyed its competitive viability and or enjoyability. So those are the three controversies that are surrounding this codex. Now, the first one I'm going to address right off the bat. Pain tokens, apparently according to some people, have been nerfed, and basically a lot of the pain abilities are just recycled. So, what I will say about this is just not true. Some of the pain token abilities have been recycled, but they are on units that were already really good before and didn't want to get nerfed. For example, Scourges with heavy weapons, right? Scourges with dark lances or haywire blasters. Could you imagine a scenario in which they lost their ability to move 6 inches after they shoot, or lost their ability to reroll hits? That would be horrible, right? So some units have kept their old quote-unquote abilities like reroll hits and stuff like that, but that's essentially just because they don't want, at least the creators of the Codex didn't want the Dark Eldar to lose the damage they had in the shooting phase. Because Dark Eldar is primarily a combat army. The Index, unfortunately, was really good in combat, was really good. But this took months and months of patching. If you guys remember the beginning of 10th edition, Dark Eldar were actually one of the worst armies in the entire game. And that's because a lot of their units simply had a lot of their teeth taken away in the beginning of 10th. Now, what the Codex has done is diversified pain tokens. And now pain tokens, pain abilities, which are associated with the different Dark Eldar datasheets, offer a myriad of buffs and debuffs that help the unit define its role in your list. So for example, if you have a Ravager, right? A Ravager is a long-range anti-tank or anti-infantry, if you build it that way, option that is really good at reducing the amount of wounds a vehicle has across the table. Now, you might not be able to one-shot a vehicle with 3 Dark Lances, but you will certainly put damage on it, at least that's the concept, with its ability to reroll all hit rolls. Now again, they took away its pain token. You can no longer give it a pain token to reroll all hits, but the ability that it has is now just reroll all hits against units with starting strength that is full, right? That are at starting strength. The pain ability hits that enemy unit with a debuff, a -1 to hit debuff. So the idea is that if you are able to draw line of sight to a unit with a Ravager, but with nothing else, the Ravager has the option of throwing out a debuff on that unit. So that is unique, right? That is something that is unique. And a lot of Dark Eldar units have unique pain token abilities that have just not been recycled, right? I think the idea that, a lot of the pain abilities were already in the index is just not true, right? These abilities are not being recycled. These are new abilities that they're getting. And yes, they can help a unit define its role in your list. For example, witches were a unit that before weren't really that great. I mean, you probably took a unit of them just because you had Lilith, right? And having Lilith in any list is like an auto-include, and it still is, right? Lilith is an exceptionally powerful character, but she needs a bodyguard unit, and witches were the only thing that could do it. So even though witches weren't a good unit by any measure, having Lilith in your list meant that you usually wanted to take a squad of witches. However, now witches are buffed, so they have a pain ability that allows them to advance and charge or fall back and charge. That's a really powerful pain token ability that once required a stratagem to be able to use it with any unit, but primarily with witches, right? Witches really do like advance and charge because they're really fast, and you have Lilith in the unit, which is a just absolutely amazing character, right? So a lot of the abilities just have not been recycled. So that's just not a true point. I heard that a couple of times, and it's just not true. Also, let's look at another fact, right? Every combat-based Druhkari unit got their combat stats buffed, and some even got a damage-based pain ability to make up for the loss of rerolls. And we'll be talking more about that in just a second. But essentially, yeah, you can't reroll to hit anymore, so what did the designers of the Druhkari Codex do? Well, they simply said, we're going to just buff the units, right? So they don't have to rely on a pain token to be effective in combat. They can just be effective without any kind of direct buff. And yeah, basically, that's the answer to that question, right? Have pain tokens really been nerfed? And do the tokens only give units abilities that they already had in the index? The answer is just absolutely not. This is verifiable, right? There's a couple of units that did do this. Like one of the biggest offenders, I think, is the Archon himself, right? Rerolls hits rolls with a pain token. And if you join him to a Kabbalite unit, they get reroll wound rolls when attacking a unit on an objective. Now, compared to the Codex, that just seems worse, right? Because now it's only reroll all wounds if they're on an objective, and it's reroll ones elsewhere. So you're not getting the full benefit from that. The trade-off, though, is that the Archon is much better now, right? The Archon has much better abilities than just that ability. So you get the ability to, for example, use a free stratagem once per round. You get the ability to unbattle shock something, which, by the way, I didn't think that was that good until I went up against a NID player. Right? Shadows in the Warp. Guess what? Shadows in the Warp, you can still unbattle shock yourself, right? At the start of any phase. So yes, you won't be able to, score the objective if you fail that battle shock test. But what you can do is you can ensure that your unit can be targeted with stratagems. So that is a good ability. You also have, a better damage profile as well on the Archon. So again, pain token abilities, yes, they don't allow hit rerolls throughout the whole army or advance or charge rerolls, but they offer a myriad of other things that benefit your list as a whole and give you a lot of tools to work with. Okay, so here's the next controversy, and this is the most common by far, that losing hit rerolls with pain tokens reduces the damage, advance, and charge reliability of your units. Now, I will say this, it does absolutely reduce the effectiveness of advance and charge roll reliability, right? Not having the option of rerolling charges and advances, does obviously reduce the reliability of them. That's true. There's not a lot of things that have replaced it, right? You can take a succubus, for example, and in a pinch, you can always, kind of reroll with a command reroll for a CP. That's okay. A succubus could give you a reroll for a pain token, but in general, a lot of units did lose this. So that is true. That's a good point by people who made it. However, I think that the argument that they lost the damage associated with pain tokens is actually just not true. Because not only do a lot of pain tokens offer damage buffs for the unit, but the base damage of the unit itself without the pain token usage has been increased in a vast majority of units. And overall, based on my math, the only units that really suffer from this change are characters and units that were trying to fish for sixes, basically trying to reroll all the dice for sixes for lethal or sustained hits. So a unit like Lilith, for example, is a great thing to bring up because you can no longer fish for sixes for her. You get one roll. If there's not a lot of sixes in that roll, you can't just pick up all the dice again and roll them again for some more sixes. You have to abide by what she rolls. She is slightly cheaper, and she also just hits really hard herself, but she's not going to hit quite as hard now because of that pain token loss. However, witches have been buffed also, so that is something to take account for. And just like witches, vast majority of units in the Codex have had their base damage buff to compensate or are at or around the same cost. So witches cost 90 points. They cost 80 points in the index, and witches are just much better at a base level. Incubi are pretty much exactly the same as far as their damage against infantry targets, and in certain detachments, their damage is actually better than in the index, or the same. And Hellions' damage is much better, despite them losing the additional pip of AP and reroll hits that pain tokens granted them. So, let's look at some examples. Let's prove it, right? Because, of course, without proof, what I'm saying could just be complete bullshit. So here we go. 5 Hellions versus regular Marines with a single pain token. Now, all of these tests that I'm going to do are going to be with a single pain token use because that's what they would use in the index. So I'm not accounting for other things. I'm not accounting for things like lethal hits or anything that the datasheet would not include normally. So no stratagem use and stuff like that. Now, obviously, I'm also not accounting for detachment bonuses, but these things do play a big role in the Codex because a lot of the detachments have really strong buffs, really strong stratagems for those specific units. Anyway, even at the basic level with a single pain token, Codex Hellions will outperform Index Hellions by a significant amount. Index Hellions kill about 5 Space Marines. So they deal about 10 wounds. That's a squad wipe. However, notice how it is just 10 wounds. It is exactly a squad wipe, which means there could be a good chance, guys, that you don't kill the unit, right? You don't kill the unit. You don't get the full amount of kills. They attack you back. Maybe they kill a couple models themselves with the sergeant. That could be bad, right? Your Hellions could honestly be in a losing situation there, and depending on what unit they're going against. However, Codex Hellions will kill their target. And not only will they kill their target, they're in a place where they're dealing 14 wounds, and that puts them right at about the level where you can use a stratagem on the squad and also guarantee that you kill a character attached to a 5-man Marine unit. Also, the Codex unit's damage is better versus other targets, like Terminators or lighter vehicles, because they have the extra strength and attacks from their Pain ability. So not only are Hellions better against regular Space Marines, but they're better against other units too, Terminators and vehicles alike. And by the way, little side note, they're also better against lighter infantry because you have more attacks with Hellions now, right? You're getting +1 attack per model. If you have 5 models, you're getting 15 attacks in the Index. In the Codex, you're getting 20, right? And you get much more as a squad of 10. So Hellions are overall a much stronger unit in the Codex than they were in the Index. Also, Hellions had kind of a crappy ability in the Index, fall back and charge, which might not seem like that big of a deal, which might seem good actually, but for Dark Eldar it's really not, because Hellions aren't durable enough to benefit from it. Whereas Codex Hellions have a D6 move, which actually, just like a Ranger move, right? When an enemy unit ends a move within 9 inches of the Hellions, they get to make a reactive move of D6 inches. This can help a lot. This means that they could possibly be safe from an enemy charge, which means you might be able to get more activations out of that unit. Okay, so looking at the next example, we have Incubi versus Marines. Now, in this example, it's going to be a single pain token once again. We're not adding in characters because realistically, it's going to be the same result. Index versus Codex, right? In the Index, a squad of 5 Incubi does 12 wounds, and that means you're going to wipe the squad, and you're going to wipe 1 extra model. In the Codex, they deal 12 wounds with the token, and that means a squad wipe plus an additional model. Exactly the same. So despite losing rerolls to hit, Incubi are still able to hit hard enough to essentially guarantee that a squad of Marines will be wiped. Now, the Codex unit's damage is better against Terminators and lighter vehicles as well because you have strength 5, so automatically wounding on 5s versus wounding on 6s against things that are toughness 8 and 9 is going to massively help the unit. The exception, of course, is in Kabalite Cartel, in which case the Incubi can just kill knights. Right? Like the combinations that exist in Kabalite Cartel or with lethal hits is just absolutely insane, and you will dominate knights if that's the case. Okay, let's look at our last example, Witches versus Marines. So single pain token here again. In the Index, they do 6 wounds dealt, which means 3 models destroyed. Again, Witches are not good at taking out Marines. Typically, they're good at taking out lighter infantry. In the Codex, you will do 7 wounds dealt, which is 3.5 models destroyed. Really not that much of a difference, but again, just showing based on the numbers, the Codex is doing more damage, right? Now, Lilith herself won't do more damage. That's something to take into account. But Lilith's buffs, giving +1 strength and +1 AP, especially when factoring that in with gladiatorial weapons, will mean that harder armor targets like Space Marines will go down a lot quicker. And this also exponentially increases the damage of a split unit of Witches because you're able to take all of the special weapons, the gladiatorial weapons and the Succubus power or Pegatrix power weapon in the same split squad. So a squad of 5 Witches with regular Hecatori blades can be a good, movement blocker or screening style unit that's maybe in reserve. And then the actual damage dealing side of it can punch up against a variety of targets for a cheap cost. So even in this case, where we're looking at a unit that really should be benefiting the most from rerolls to hit and +1 AP, we're actually seeing here that there's not that much difference. In fact, the Codex is still more damage, which I think is very telling. A lot of players have, written comments to me saying, Proxy Hammer, I think you're really underestimating how much damage the Codex has lost in comparison with the Index. And they've been quoting the fact that you can reroll hits, on stuff in the Index, and you can't reroll hits on everything in the Codex. But in reality, the base stats have changed to the point where the Codex is still more damage, right? And honestly, you just can't lie with numbers, guys. Like, numbers don't lie. I used a Math Hammer app. I used Adept Roll for this. Very accurate app. There's other accurate Warhammer apps. I mean, you could use a calculator to figure some of this stuff out, right? But if you do it right, these are the calculations, these are the numbers, and the Codex comes out on top every single time. And that's going to be the same with most combat units. And again, the only time that's different is when units are fishing for 6s and they hit on 2s. So they're going against a really, really tough target that's kind of out of their league anyway. Like witches with lethal hits against a knight, right? In that case, reroll hits would probably be much better. But when is that realistically going to happen? Witches typically don't kill knights, right? And if you take a look at Hellions, for example, Hellions actually do much more damage in the right detachments against knights. Like a big squad of Hellions in the Spectacle of Spite against a knight in the Codex will outperform the damage of a Hellion unit, in the Index every single day of the week. Just because you have the extra strength, you have the lance bonus. There's a lot of extra damage bonuses that a lot of people aren't accounting for in the data sheets themselves. Okay, now let's talk about one of the things that I agree with more, which is losing 4 data sheets killed the variability of the Codex and destroyed its competitive viability and enjoyability. Now, I don't agree with all of this. There's one part I agree with, and that's only because I respect the opinions of others when it comes to subjective, kind of enjoyment of things. But did it kill the variability of the Codex, right? We lost 4 data sheets, them being the Beast Pack, Court of the Archon, Urian, and Grotesques. The Beast Pack was an Alpha Strike style unit that was meant to move block, screen, or muck up your opponent. In the case where you're going against an opponent that doesn't respect the Beast Pack, it could win you the game in 1 turn. But again, that's very rare. That's if your opponent disrespects the Beast Pack and just lets them kind of get into where they need to go. The Court of the Archon was a unit buff for Kabalite warriors. It buffed Kabalites, giving them lethal hits, and it buffed the, combat ability of the Archon and the squad by giving them fights first. It was kind of like a jack of all trades unit that was pretty strong in the Index, but was complicated and took a long time to activate and actually shoot everything and use all their abilities. So it was a fun unit, I think, but you didn't always see people bring it in every single competitive list, right? You saw it seldomly, but it was there. It was good. You saw Urian get lost, right? Urian was basically a staple in most Dark Eldar lists. However, I don't believe that Urian in the Codex is actually necessary. I don't believe he's a necessary unit when you take the Codex as a whole. I do think he was kind of necessary in the Index because Dark Eldar and the Index were honestly rather weak. Now, it's weird to say that because there's a lot of players that are really good out there that can play Dark Eldar very well, like Skari. He plays Dark Eldar to, the highest level in the world. But I don't think you can really look at the Codex, or Index, the Index as a whole and say, this Index is flawless because Skari was able to take this so far, right? Because the fact of the matter is that the Index, unfortunately, was lacking the very thing that a lot of people are saying was lost in the Codex, which is variability. There wasn't a lot of variability in the Index. And actually, you can see for yourself. You can look at several lists, competitive Dark Eldar lists that were run throughout the edition. What changed? Very little. Very little. The core units remained largely the same the entire time. And I think that's just honestly, guys, that's just an indication of a book that doesn't have a lot of options, right? And the reason it didn't have a lot of options, there were some things that were just almost never used in certain detachments because they were terrible, right? You just did not use certain units in certain detachments. They were useless, honestly, in my honest opinion, right? Like there was some place for units like racks, but it was very rare. There was some place for units like witches in certain detachments, but again, unless you were running, Sky Splinter Assault, witches didn't hit that hard. So you were only taking witches for Lilith, right? There wasn't a whole lot of options, is my point. And lastly, grotesques. Grotesques were really only good in one detachment, maybe two, maybe in Real Space Raid. But again, Real Space Raid wasn't a good detachment. A lot of people hated it. It was very carried, I would say, by the point decreases the Dark Eldar got throughout the edition. And the only reason why grotesques weren't, kind of seen as this pariah of the Dark Eldar Codex or Index was because of Reaper's Wager, right? Reaper's Wager kind of revived grotesques and helped them be more successful in competitive play because it gave them a lot of stratagem options and it gave them the ability to be faster, more durable, and hit harder. Simple as that. So grotesques were actually good in the Index, but they weren't a good unit overall, let's be honest. Now, we did lose 4 datasheets, but we did gain 3 of them back in different ways. We got Lady Malice, Scourge of the Shard Garbines, and the Hand of the Archon. Lady Malice is a great melee powerhouse unit that buffs Incubi considerably. She gives buffs to Coblite Warriors as well if you're looking for a little bit of a cheaper package with her. But she also offers a Vect Aura, which is very powerful. And lastly, but not least, a redeploy ability so that you can redeploy things like Mandrakes or maybe infiltrating Coblites and Coblite Cartel so that you don't have to just sacrifice those units turn 1. You can screen out your opponent's infiltrators and then redeploy back so you don't have to worry about getting alpha striked by an infiltration unit. So 2 of these units here, Lady Malice and Scourges with Shard Carbines. Scourges with Shard Carbines being a great choice for objectives with 6-inch Deep Strike as their pain ability, or -1 AP for Coblite Warriors to have a little bit of a better shooting profile, right? These datasheets add a lot to the army. The Hand of the Archon is kind of a, I would say, niche to bad pick usually, just because they're so expensive for what you get, and you don't get a lot of damage. It's a hybrid unit that doesn't really do a lot against anything, and unfortunately, it ends up not being that great. So the Hand of the Archon, not that great of a unit, but 2 of these units are really good. Now, obviously, I'd like to see the Beast Pack, the Core, Urian, and Grotesques return, but we do see that these options have replacements in the Codex. Reavers can easily replace the Beast Pack as a fast-moving, early-game move blocker that can also do some damage in melee, right? Of course, they do pretty good damage. They move 24 inches with their pain ability, and they do decent damage with their, Blade Vein, Ride By, Eviscerating Flyby, and Cluster Caltrops to reroll some mortal results for that flyby. And they also are armed with, heat lances. A couple of them can take heat lances. They can take, splinter rifles, base, and then they, of course, have decent melee. The only thing that really doesn't have a direct replacement, again, the Court of the Archon can easily be replaced with stratagems and stuff like that. I would say Urian is the only one that doesn't have a replacement. He was just a very unique part of the Dark Eldar army that could survive long enough on an objective to score primary, and I don't think we have that anymore. So that's kind of unfortunate. However, I don't think a Dark Eldar army should be based around one character being able to survive everything in the game, which for some reason Urian always did. He was very annoying, and it was insanely difficult to deal with him. Insanely difficult. When I used him, my opponents always hated him. When he was used against me, I was always trying to find ways of using my resources effectively to kill him, but it just never worked out evenly, right? It was always like I ended up spending 150 points to kill him, and then I'd lose 150 points in return, and he would just hop back up, right? Or maybe I got a charge off on him and I managed to kill him. And then it was like, okay, great. But then I spent 200 points trying to kill the guy, right? So either way, he was really good. Really hard model to deal with. And unfortunately, he's gone. So he doesn't have a replacement, but the other units do, right? Grotesques are a tough unit, but honestly, Racks pretty easily replace Grotesques. Grotesques were not that tough. They were toughness 5. Racks are just 1 less toughness, and if you use the, Covenant Coterie detachment, you can get toughness 5 Racks. They also revive themselves, so you can revive Racks with Homunculus. Now, obviously, I think the competitive viability of the Codex is way higher than the Index. I think you have more options. You have more rules that you can use at your disposal. Pain abilities are giving you a bunch of different utility, options and stuff like that, which may not seem good on paper initially, but when you're actually playing in a game can make the difference. We have a lot of those things in the Codex. Also, the damage is higher overall in the Codex. Now, the last thing, as far as enjoyability goes, that is purely subjective, right? If you were running 3 beast packs before and you were loving a triple beast pack list, I can totally understand if you don't want to play the game anymore because they just, maybe you spent $600 on getting the out of production beasts, or maybe you spent a bunch of time painting them, right? And the enjoyability of not being able to, run those is just so low, you don't really want to play the new Codex. I totally get that. But I will say this, the new Codex has a load of different builds that you can do. So for, Dark Eldar players who are not fixated on one of the 4 units that were lost or a mix of them, can try out a bunch of different combos, a bunch of different builds, and honestly, in my opinion, there's a lot more flavor in the Codex than there ever was in the Index, despite the loss of units. I know that's an unpopular thing to say, but in my honest opinion, just having more units in a Codex doesn't necessarily mean there's more flavor in a Codex. Let me give you a great example. Space Marines. Codex Space Marines is a flavorless book. I'm sorry. I know a lot of people love Space Marines and everything, but it's flavorless. You know why? Because most of the Marine units do a very similar thing, right? Of course, they have different abilities and stuff. But if you look at the units, like, okay, great example. You look at something like a Space Marine Assault Squad, right? Jump Pack Intercessors. Then you have a squad of Space Marines that is called Assault Intercessors. They do basically the same thing. They both charge the opponent. They both have chain swords. The only difference is one flies and does impact hits, and one gets into combat with you and rerolls wound rolls. But they both do the same thing to the same kinds of targets. Do you get what I'm saying with that? Right? They have different data sheets, a bunch of these different data sheets, but they essentially do the same thing, which is, I am big, tough Marine. Like, I get into combat with you and I wreck I wreck you. Or if you're another Marine, I do some damage to you and then you do some damage back, and, whatever it is, right? And then you have units like Blade Guard veterans, which everybody takes, and they just do one thing, which is this: they just smash people in combat. There's nothing wrong with that. But it's not necessarily, giving the Codex a bunch of flavor, right? Because essentially, what is flavor? Flavor isn't having more units, in my opinion. It's having really cool, badass special rules and unique combinations and things like that like really make a unit fun to use, or make a combination of units or a different type of build fun to use. In my opinion, Ultramarines, and I'm actually, I'm actually talking about Ultramarines when I talk about this. Ultramarines Gladius Task Force is very vanilla. It's very boring, and I think honestly it doesn't have a lot of flavor. Again, that's my personal opinion. People have different personal opinions, but the Codex is very enjoyable. If you like Eldar and Dark Eldar and you like how that really fast, hard-hitting playstyle is, then you're going to love the Codex because it's exactly that. It's exactly that. It feels very Dark Eldar. So despite losing all of the out of production units, I think the Codex actually has more flavor than the Index does because it has cooler special rules, it has really awesome combos that you can use in it, and it just feels more like a true Dark Eldar Codex, unlike the Index, which just kind of felt like you were shuffling around a bunch of crap. There was a lot of trash units that were, honestly just not that cool. And I feel like a lot of the stuff got better and only got marginally more expensive. So it feels a lot better. Okay, here's a little bit of a, treat for you guys out there. Now, we did lose grotesques, but guess what? Grotesques were actually not really what they were in this edition, because back in 3rd edition, grotesques were actually just racks. So if you look at the old 3rd edition, back then they were called Codex entries. If you look at the old Codex entry here for elites, grotesques were one of the units, and they were basically racks. They were Dark Eldar that, loved to torture themselves. They loved to torture their own bodies. As you can see, the picture of the grotesque right up there in the top left, he loves it. He loves just mutilating his own flesh. That was part of the lore. So grotesques were originally kind of more like racks, right? They had, strength 4, toughness 3, 2 wounds. Initiative isn't something we have anymore, but there were initiative 3, which was slow by Eldar standards. Whew. Initiative 3 was the same speed as an Imperial Guardsman, just for the reference. They had really low leadership, so they were really stupid, really like kind of kind of these blundering idiots that just loved their own like masochism. They loved causing pain to themselves. Just imagine, just the ultimate masochist. He has the ball gag in and everything, and he's loving it. That's a grotesque. But, they're pretty much racks. So they're kind of interchangeable in my honest opinion, because I've played the game for so long that, grotesques to me, I know in the modern sense, they're like the Terminator equivalent for the Dark Eldar. Well, back then they were still the Terminator equivalent, but, nothing was as it seemed, right? Like the grotesques, they don't seem that tough on paper until you read their special rule, feel no pain, which means they can only be killed if they are insta-killed by shooting. But for some reason, this didn't affect them in combat. Very weird. Very weird. Again, a lot of people tell me there was way more flavor in the game in 3rd edition. I will agree with one thing. There was way more flavor text, but the flavor of the game was salt. And if you didn't like your food salty, then you better GTFO, because that's how the game was back then. Now, you might be thinking, oh God, here Proxy Hammer goes about the old days. Just read this ability and let me know in the comments if this sounds like something that is fun for both players. Grotesques are inured to pain and shrug off minor wounds that would leave another creature writhing in agony. Because of this, they ignore shooting hits from weapons whose strength is not at least twice the grotesque's toughness. I.e., example, they are only affected by shooting weapons with a strength of 6+. This means that range attacks can affect grotesques. This means that range attacks that can affect grotesques will always get an outright kill. You either kill them outright or not at all, no half measures. Note that hits in close combat affect the grotesque normally, as you can chop bits off them. Which, by the way, yeah, great flavor, but it doesn't exactly make much sense. The game never made sense, and anybody who ever argued that the rules made sense to reality was either highly delusional or somebody who just wanted the game to be a little bit easier for them. Basically, people who are complainers that, oh my God, your Eldar can move behind a building and then shoot me and then move somewhere else. That's not realistic. That's OP, right? Whatever. But as you can tell, this codex is full of flavor. It's just not rules flavor. They're salty rules that are kind of OP and broken and busted. And the flavor was all in the jokes that GW would write in the book, right? So again, honestly, I've played the game for so many years. I loved 3rd edition, by the way. I loved it. I was a kid, had a lot of fun playing it, but it wasn't the most balanced edition. and neither were the balance changes after 3rd edition. 4th edition, 5th edition were extremely unbalanced. 6th edition was unbalanced. 7th was unbalanced. I mean, you guys know the whole story up until, honestly, 9th edition was probably like okay near the end of it. And then 10th edition, they really concentrated on making the game balanced. And I do appreciate that. But in a lot of ways, a lot of people have been saying they've been getting rid of the flavor of codexes and stuff like this. And realistically, I know this is going to sound crazy, but I have been having more fun in 10th edition, gameplay wise, than I had in 9th edition or any other edition for that. Again, that sounds crazy, but honestly, I think the rules they got something right finally, which is the rule system. I'd like them to add some of the more characteristic changes back. I'd like them to add back, for example, Psyker's ability to change their powers up if they want to. Like, I think Psykers like Farseers should be able to choose what psychic power they have, stuff like that. But other than that, I think it's in a good place. And before we hit 11th edition, I'm going to have a video out sharing my ideas about what I think they should actually change about the game and what I think they got right in 10th edition, because I think they got a lot of stuff right, even though they did make some mistakes. Okay, so in conclusion, I know that was a huge rant there about the old days and stuff, but I just saw that the other day and had to share it with you guys. But overall, I think the Druhkari Codex has more damage, and again, this is damage that is verifiable through just facts and data. Utility, also verifiable because there's a lot of utility abilities that the Codex or the Index just didn't have. And, dare I say, flavor than the Index. And by flavor, I mean rules that make you feel like you're playing an actual Dark Eldar army and not just, again, just shuffling crap around the battlefield. That's how it felt sometimes, honestly, like using things like witches or racks. It was just like, oh God, if Lilith isn't in the unit's not going to do anything. And I know you do need trash units in the game, but it was just too much, right? And I think the Codex has a lot more flavor in that the rules are a lot more fun and stuff like that. And I think even though losing all of the out of production models sucks, obviously, like I didn't want that to happen. I wanted to see the Druhkari get a range refresh, which, by the way, guys, just to let you know, GW specifically chose to update all the Space Marine stuff instead of updating the Dark Eldar. And again, what I mean by update the Space Marine stuff is like they have like a few new sculpts for like Space Marines. Like I know the Raven Guard Chapter Master like looks really cool, and I know that's awesome. But they prioritize that over the Dark Eldar range refresh, even though we haven't had new models since 5th edition. Guys, that's crazy. That was in 2011. Yeah. Yes, it's been 14 years, ladies and gentlemen. It's been 14 long years. Now, I will say the models have aged beautifully. A lot of the models in the range are looking great. But it would have been really nice to get all of the fine cast kits refreshed, right? And that's what I'm mad about. I'm mad at GW for not prioritizing the Xenos factions and once again, just bending over for the, massive Space Marine D that is continuously inserted into GW. I mean, honestly, I know that a lot of people buy Space Marines. I get it. But if you stopped pandering so much to the Space Marine community and actually gave Xenos players something once in a while, like, again, commiserate with what you give Space Marines, then more people would be into Xenos. More people would like Xenos factions. More people would get into the Dark Eldar and show interest in it if you actually updated the range once in a while and gave it some attention. Instead of just kind of brushing it off, giving it a few Warhammer, community articles, giving it one new sculpt, which is like the bare ass minimum. And of course, the Archon, I guess, is a new sculpt as well, but that's a model we already had. Like, players would play Dark Eldar more, right? Like, it took them 20 years to get warp spiders, plastic warp spiders. 20 years. Took them a really, like, almost the same amount of time, like 18 years for Swooping Hawks. There's still Eldar models like the Viper. They're like 25 years old. I think, what was it, last year, the Viper had its like 30th anniversary or some crap. The Viper's a 25 to 30-year-old model. And for a company that's like leading the industry in minis, that's unacceptable. Right? That's unacceptable. I don't accept it. So yeah, that's what I'm pissed off about. I don't think everything about the Codex is great. That's what I think sucks. But despite that, I think the rules of the Codex are fantastic. The rules and the gameplay of the Codex is honestly really awesome. And in a vast majority of ways is better than the Index. Right? Because essentially the Index, even though it did have those data sheets, the rest of it did not feel that great sometimes. And there was really only 2 detachments that were good. Sky Splinter Assault and Reaper's Wager. The Index detachment that we first got was shite. It was so bad that it forced one of my buddies who posts YouTube videos, it forced him right out of the 40K community for a bit. He sold all of his Dark Eldar because he was like, fuck this, I don't want to play this crap. It doesn't feel right. It's not fun. It's flavorless. And he was right. The Dark Eldar Index was fucking flavorless. And I'll say that again. It was flavorless. It became better with time because GW released new rules for the Index, right? New detachments. So it became more flavorful. But at the end of the day, it didn't start out that way. And the Codex started out really strong, and I'm liking where it's going. I'm actually really, really excited and, ecstatic to play games with Dark Eldar. And I'm really excited to make videos. I tried to make videos a while ago about the Dark Eldar, but goddamn, it was so boring playing them sometimes that I had to be like, you know what? It's not worth it, man. It's not worth it to talk about, these Dark Eldar units because I don't enjoy playing Dark Eldar right now that much. Back when Real Space Raid was like the only detachment we had. So anyway, guys, that's my whole spiel. Again, sorry if it turned into a bit of a rant there at the end. But the reason I made this video is because I wanted to make it very clear that I think the rules are fantastic, even though I disagree with GW's choice to get rid of new models. I do think the flavor of the Codex overall is much better. And I think that's pretty undisputable. I've been a Dark Eldar player for a very long time. Eldar player. I've loved both factions for a long time. Dark Eldar have always been kind of my side bitch, to be honest. But I really like playing them when they're exciting to play because they're really fun when GW gets it right. It's just the Dark Eldar, they're kind of like the ugly, stepchild, of the family. So they always get beat up, It's kind of like the Cinderella story where like the ugly stepsisters are always like, basically making fun of Cinderella. Well, guess what? The Dark Eldar are Cinderella, bitch. And I think they deserve to go to the ball. Anyway, that's it for today. Have a good one, you guys. Thank you to all my supporters and Patreon members. You guys are awesome. Thank you for supporting the channel. Really appreciate it. If you do want to help support the channel and keep content like this alive, consider joining the Patreon. Again, you can join for absolutely free, but if you are a paid member, you will get ad-free videos on the Patreon. I upload all my videos on there for, basically no extra cost to your membership. And on top of that, it will be ad-free, of course. So also, if you want to grab some Dark Eldar or Eldar inspired apparel on the channel store page, or some discounted Eldar minis on Amazon, I'll leave the links for those in the description below. All right, guys, that's going to be it for today's video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you guys next time. Have a good one, everybody. Peace out.